In the soft rolling hills of northern Italy, with just days to go before deploying, a young soldier sent messages to his loved ones and prepared to travel to Turkey. He wasn't supposed to share information about where he was going, troop movement security and all that, but he just couldn't help himself. He wanted his loved ones to be able to find him and find his colleagues. It was unfortunate, of course, that his loved ones weren't his parents or a high school sweetheart, but other members of a white supremacist neo-Nazi community. This is Conduct and Becoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Ethan Melzer grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. Southern friends, I've done my best to drop the inapplicable letters in the city name, but I know I can't get it quite right. Much like pronouncing Camp Lejeune, we're going to cut our losses and forge ahead. Melzer struggled in his young life. He faced abuse and endured self-harm. Then he discovered methamphetamine. To fund his methamphetamine habit, he also sold drugs. He claims during this time that he joined a Louisville chapter of the Bloods gang, the Bounty Hunter Bloods. In 2017, he did shoot a dealer in the arm after running off with an ounce of weed. That same year, he told a friend of his that he was pleased by both the Pulse nightclub and Las Vegas mass shootings. Around 2018, from what I can put together, Melzer discovered what he described as satanic Nazi edgelords. And while literally any of those words may have been sufficient to push others away, Melzer decided he found his people in the Order of the Nine Angles. The organization was established in the 1970s as a Nazi Satanist group in Britain and has promoted extreme violence ever since. Membership estimates vary widely between a few dozen to a couple thousand. By late 2018, it seemed to the outside world that Melzer was beginning to turn his life around and beginning to stabilize. He was a participant in the U.S. Department of Labor's Job Corps program. The Job Corps is a residential training program that supports people completing their high school education and offers job training and placement assistance. In the Job Corps, he got into a routine: early wake-up, regular meals, reliable bed. He kept that trend going and joined the Army. I don't know how much of his past Melzer disclosed to his recruiter, but I think a lot of his previous behavior would be challenging to get waivers for. Melzer joined the Army in June 2019 when he was 20 years old. He walked onto Fort Moore and signed his enlistment statement disavowing any allegiance to extremist groups. Within a year of walking onto Fort Moore, he'd be escorted off base in handcuffs. Melzer's enlistment prohibited him from obtaining any tattoo affiliated with or symbolizing extremist philosophies. Nevertheless, between his enlistment and reporting for duty as a paratrooper, he got a distinctive Order of the Nine Angles tattoo on his left arm. Some of his newfound people warned him it was a bad idea to stay in contact with the Order while in the military. Specifically, one user said, "You're kind of playing with fire. The UCMJ has a few things to say about members of the armed forces holding affiliates with, quote, extremist groups. Just food for thought if you're serious." But these warnings didn't dissuade Melzer. Later, when another member sought advice from Melzer about joining the Marine Corps, he wished him luck, but advised him to train and get out, to not waste any time becoming patriotic. He said of the bases he visited that most deserved to be burned. The Army, he claimed, was an opportunity to hone his violent skills he would need to start a race war. In the early fall, Melzer bought his first copy of the Order's Satanic Bible. You know those little crayon highlighters that don't bleed through the pages? Those weren't quite right for his new book. Bleeding was kind of what he was after. Melzer marked his favorite passages with blood. In September 2019, Melzer deployed overseas to Italy with the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. While stationed in Vicenza, he continued to consume propaganda from the order, from ISIS, and from other extremist groups. Melzer struggled to socialize at his new duty station and felt that he wasn't really getting enough opportunities to incite that race war. In November 2019, Private Melzer obtained his secret security clearance and signed his classified information non-disclosure agreement. Signing it acknowledged that he knew that the unauthorized disclosure of the classified information could be a violation of federal criminal law. And if Melzer thought the end of 2019 was a bad time to socialize, he was in for the same abrupt wake-up call we all got in the spring of 2020. When COVID hit northern Italy, Melzer and his unit locked down, and he ramped up his visits to extremist chat rooms. On April 21st, 2020, he accessed a new Telegram group for the Order of the Nine Angles. The moderator claimed to be a Canadian radicalized after getting wounded serving in Iraq. Melzer had to prove to the moderator that he really was an American soldier. So he sent a picture of his army beret, a knife, a 20-ounce can of Red Bull, a ski mask, and his Order of the Nine Angles satanic Bible. I think what really sold it was the energy drink, the true fuel for the armed services. Look forward to that photo posting on the Conduct Unbecoming Instagram soon. Melzer downloaded and watched videos of jihadist attacks on U.S. troops and American military facilities. He watched the executions of both civilians and soldiers. And something about the content he was rapidly consuming really resonated with him. In early May 2020, 2 months into the COVID pandemic and with all the uncertainties that came with whether or not troop movement between nations would be possible, the Army told Melzer that he was being reassigned to a unit scheduled for further foreign deployment. His new unit was competitively selected and would be going to Turkey to guard an isolated but sensitive military installation. The unit began to ramp up, getting ready for their deployment. Melzer attended his mandatory pre-deployment training. Some briefings were classified, others unclassified. In these briefings, Melzer learned about the purpose, layout, and security of the military base he would soon be heading to. He learned about and practiced for different threat scenarios, and how the soldiers stationed there would respond to various potential terrorist attacks. A quick aside here with a funny story about living overseas in military family housing. The military had a bevy of individual emergency alerts available for the different scenarios we could potentially face. These included tsunami warnings, biochemical attack warnings, and the more standard stuff like fire alarms. A few times a year, the building would test our emergency alert system and run through all 13 or 14 different alarms. The tests were a little unpredictable in terms of timing, and I only had so many hours of the day that overlapped with the West Coast. So, if you were the attorney on the other end of my call, who heard my walls begin screaming, "There has been a terrorist attack," I am very sorry for the immediate concern you felt for my safety. But back to the baddies. As soon as Melzer realized he had access to important and sensitive information, he began passing it along to his online community. This almost immediately after attending a briefing on the terrorist planning cycle, where instructors taught Melzer and his unit how to spot an individual planning a terrorist attack. Potential observation indicators included an interest in security, equipment, or personnel, sketching diagrams or taking notes about building plans, security shift changes, security vulnerabilities, or security locations. using binoculars from nearby locations, and collecting or possessing materials related to the sites being observed. Things like detailed maps, blueprints, or floor plans. On his phone, Melzer himself had a screenshot from his first day of briefing, a satellite photo of the sensitive military base in Turkey. Later, one of the soldiers in his unit said he felt like someone should have known. Someone should have realized what Melzer was planning. Melzer shared travel dates, locations, armaments, topography, and security details with his friends. He told them what the choke points on the base would be, and that it would be guarded by approximately 40 men with 40 M4 rifles and perhaps a handful of pistols. Melzer described the convoy the unit would make to the base. If they couldn't attack his unit, he told them that a new unit would come for relief every 2 to 4 months. Melzer shared all of this information because he and his online friends wanted to cause a mass casualty event specifically victimizing soldiers. The moderator of the community messaged Melzer privately to ask if he was ready to die for the cause. Melzer said a successful attack would be worth it, that he would have died successfully. Another asked Melzer how he thought he'd get away with the attack. Melzer said he didn't discuss his personal life or beliefs with anyone, and that he was confident the United States would blame the attack on ISIS. But Melzer and the moderator would need more bodies, more people committed to their cause who would help them carry out the attack. The moderator found 4 others who were eager to join them. Reading this, I was reminded of the early optimism of the pandemic, how people genuinely believed they would soon be able to resume international travel, to see family and friends, to cross things off the bucket list, to, apparently, attack soldiers in Turkey. Melzer vowed to share more information once he arrived at the base. He planned to get a burner phone to stay in contact with his online community when he was required to check his phone in for security and safety. He promised he would take photographs of the facility and share the frequency and channel of the U.S. Army radio communications. Melzer knew what he was doing was wrong. He actually knew what he was doing was treason. He messaged his friends to say as much. And it was, in fact, very illegal to share the sensitive information he shared about his unit. People deploying like this often can't even tell their families where they're going, and Melzer shared location information, movement information, and security details with his online friends, his friends in a white supremacist, pro-jihadist, neo-Nazi group. They were certainly not entitled to know this sensitive information. And I did wonder, while researching, whether it was redundant to refer to a neo-Nazi group as also being a white supremacist group, but I'll leave that to you, Legal Beagle, to decide. Melzer's unit was set to leave on May 28, 2020, but their deployment got delayed. Melzer didn't tell his online friends about the delay. Instead, he told them he was already on his way, that he'd have more information for them soon. But Melzer would never join the unit in Turkey. The delay was a stall tactic to keep Melzer, specifically, in Italy. The army had to mask the reason for the delay, obviously, to avoid Melzer alerting his online friends, his co-conspirators, to the ongoing investigation. On May 30th, as his unit boarded the buses in Italy to begin their deployment travel, military investigators took Melzer into custody. In his bag, they found the Order of the Nine Angles books, as well as 2 phones. One to turn into security while he was on patrol, and one to send information and secrets. On June 10th, the FBI arrested Melzer themselves. Melzer was discovered because one of the, quote, recruits for the attack was an FBI informant. On his plane ride to Manhattan for his indictment, he spoke with FBI agents. Melzer denied he was a member of the Order of the Nine Angles initially, but eventually admitted to sending the messages revealing security information about the base in Turkey. The prosecution painted him as a one-man sleeper cell. On June 22, 2020, a grand jury in the Southern District of New York indicted Melzer. He was charged in 8 counts: conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attempting to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. military service members, attempting to murder U.S. military service members, attempting to provide and providing material support to terrorists, conspiracy to murder and maim in a foreign country, illegal transmission of national defense information believing that it could be used to the injury of the United States, and illegal delivery of national defense information. With all these charges, Melzer faced a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Melzer received legal support from the Federal Defenders of New York. The most accessible way I can describe federal defenders is to say they are public defenders for federal crimes. Over the course of their representation, Melzer's attorneys discovered that the moderator wasn't who he said he was. That is, he was not, in fact, a Canadian soldier wounded in Iraq. He was a 15-year-old boy. They built a defense around the impossibility of the plan. Between group members who weren't who they claimed to be to the incomplete attack plan that ostensibly required 5 relative amateurs run by a 15-year-old and 1 FBI informant to take on more than 36 armed soldiers. This doesn't even take into account the challenges of international travel in 2020. When the defense team moved to admit some of this evidence that might show how improbable the plot was, the U.S. Attorney's Office offered a deal. If Melzer agreed to plead guilty to just 3 of the counts, attempted murder of U.S. service members, attempting to provide and providing material support to terrorists, and illegally transmitting national defense information believing that it could be used to the injury of the United States, then they would reduce the maximum sentence from life to 45 years in prison. On June 24, 2022, Ethan Melzer pled guilty to those 3 charges. Defense attorneys pushed for a sentence of 15 years and offered evidence of a challenging childhood as mitigation. They brought in evidence of a mother that battled with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and trouble with alcohol. Things got more challenging, or perhaps more confusing, for Melzer during middle school when he realized he was gay. I don't know how to square this with the tenets of an organization that idolized Nazis. At just 21 or 22 years old when he was arrested, Melzer was still a youthful offender. Not a juvenile, but not so old that his development was complete. The defense offered, finally, that the same court handed down an 8-year sentence for a man who plotted to fire guns at a recruiting station and join the Taliban. I suspect the charges were vastly different in that case. On March 3, 2023, Melzer entered the Manhattan courtroom and led with apologies. He apologized to his family and to the men he conspired to kill. He said he wished he could fix what he did, but acknowledged that he couldn't. A military intelligence officer explained to the court that Melzer was a psychological cancer to the soldiers in his unit, that he undermined the trust soldiers had to place in one another while they serve. Melzer's hand shook as the court sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The judge categorically rejected Melzer's plea for leniency and observed it was possible, or perhaps likely, that Melzer was playing another role, just like he played soldier so he could conspire to try and murder the members of his unit. From what I gather, Melzer is working on his appeal. A former acting U.S. attorney indicated they believed the sentencing was an overreach, that the information Melzer exposed wasn't actually all that secret. In the wake of accidental Strava mapping and having host nation citizens working on the base, and the existence of satellite images, they figured the details weren't as closely guarded as Melzer and the Army made it seem. What I sit with when I look at this case is that the offensiveness doesn't come from some likelihood of success. It's offensive because it's a violation of the very necessary trust that service members put into one another to get the job done each day and return home safely. Melzer can't unring the bell. He can't claw back the information that he shared and that was further shared online. And the charge that he pled guilty to specifies that it's the sharing of the information believing that it could be used to the injury of the United States. I don't think that's the appellate hill to die on, and I suspect the lead charge, the charge for attempting to murder U.S. military service members, is the hinge point. That's the charge where the improbability argument comes into play. It's also the charge that carries the most exposure. And I think this is a tough tension to carry, balancing the improbability of success against Melzer's stated desire to harm. I'm intrigued to see where Melzer's case goes on appeal. Legal Beagle, I'm certain you picked up that there isn't an appellate opinion on this case just yet. What I found most interesting in terms of the law is that this isn't a matter the Army prosecuted. It's unclear when the Army discharged Melzer from the service, but given that Private Melzer was active duty when he committed these acts, he was also subject to the UCMJ. He could have been court-martialed for the same kinds of crimes as Brian Martin from Episode 10 and Caitlin Day from Episode 2. But he was also subject to jurisdiction from the Federal Department of Justice, and that's how he ended up in the Southern District of New York for prosecution. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted Melzer because they had concurrent jurisdiction. We had a good example of concurrent jurisdiction before in Episode 5, the Hennis case. That's where the state of North Carolina had concurrent jurisdiction over murder charges. And maybe if something goes wrong with this civilian conviction or the results of an appeal aren't tolerable, maybe the Army reasserts jurisdiction over this young man like we saw in the Hennis case. I did some digging, though, to find out just how the Federal Department of Justice had jurisdiction over Melzer. I wasn't sure if the Army base in Vincenza was truly considered U.S. soil the way embassies can be. Jurisdiction or ownership and authority over a legal matter can arise by being present in a location or by committing a crime in that location. The classic brain teaser we got in law school with jurisdiction based on location was Person A is standing on the California side of the border and fires a gunshot into Nevada, where it causes property damage on Person B's land. Where did the crime occur? Melzer, a U.S. citizen and Army soldier, was stationed in Vincenza, Italy, and used the internet to plot an armed attack on a military installation in Turkey. Where did the crime occur? I thought that was perhaps a confusing road to travel down, and I concluded I just needed to read the sections of the United States Code that Melzer was charged with violating. The code sections each lay out why the federal government gets jurisdiction over these crimes even when they were committed outside the United States. The feds had jurisdiction over the crimes because that's how Congress wrote these laws. This method cuts down on loopholes. This kind of jurisdiction could get funky if it's a foreign national committing these crimes overseas, because extradition can complicate things. But getting Melzer back to the United States and into a courtroom was pretty straightforward. The jurisdictions the feds got here is called extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's the legal authority of the United States to prosecute criminal conduct that took place outside the U.S. borders. Extraterritorial jurisdiction can be exerted by the United States alone, as it was here in many of these code sections, or it can be agreed to by the host nation. An example of that is a status of forces agreement, an agreement between a host nation and the United States, that the United States may continue to exercise jurisdiction over service members stationed in the host country. While we were in Japan, the military could still exercise jurisdiction over my spouse for the actions he took off base, like the rental car example I shared in episode 21. Here, if Melzer was planning and plotting off base using an internet cafe in the local community, for example, that's where a status of forces agreement might come into play. There's nothing out there that I could find that said why the Army didn't want to prosecute this one. I can theorize about lots of possibilities. The U.S. attorneys have a bit more time to work with, they may be more specialized. The Army might want to focus on their mission instead of this bombshell prosecution. But at the end of the day, they're just my guesses, so take them with a grain of salt. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we learn just how important patterns can be. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, endorsed, or authorized by the Department of Defense.